A baby's cry tore through the luxurious silence of the Ferraz mansion for 3 long and endless hours. Downstairs, while polishing the silverware that was worth more than her rent, Lorena Nunes felt each scream like a knife in her own chest, an anguish that was not hers, but that consumed her from within, tightening her throat. She knew that upstairs, little Miguel, only 2 months old, was alone in his very expensive crib. The all-seeing narrator knew the reason for that despair. The boy's face was red and swollen from the effort, his small, dry lips instinctively searching for the food that did not come. Beside the crib, a baby bottle with milk already soured by the afternoon heat was the silent testimony of the neglect that hung in that room. The nanny, Adriana, had left with the excuse of going to the pharmacy, but the truth is that at that exact moment she was laughing with her friends in a cafe at the mall, completely oblivious to the suffering she left behind. In the office, Gabriel, the father, a 32-year-old widower, immersed in an online meeting, forced himself to ignore the sound, treating his own son's cry as an irritating background noise that was interfering with his business. For Lorena, however, that sound was unbearable. It was the sound of the purest vulnerability. Suddenly she could not take it anymore. She dropped the dishcloth and, with her heart pounding, went up the stairs, moved by a force she barely understood, but that was stronger than any rule or common sense. As she pushed open the door to Miguel's room, a hot and stuffy air hit her, heavy with the sour and unmistakable smell of spoiled milk. The sound of the crying was even more desperate up close. They were high-pitched and weak shrieks, the sound of a living being that was exhausting its last energies. Her eyes ran to the crib, and the sight she found froze the blood in her veins. The boy was almost motionless, except for the spasms that shook his tiny body. His skin, once pink, now had a grayish tone and was hot, burning with fever. Lorena approached and touched his forehead with the back of her hand, confirming what her instinct was already screaming. He was dehydrated and burning from the inside. She looked at the bottle on the small table, a useless plastic object, and a cold, sharp anger overcame her. An anger against the irresponsible nanny, against the absent father, against a world that allowed such a helpless child to reach this state. Her breasts ached, full of the milk that her own little angel would never again nurse. It was a phantom pain, a cruel reminder of her grief, but in that instant it seemed like a calling. The decision was made not with the head, but with the soul of a mother, with a delicacy that contrasted with the urgency of the situation. Lorena lifted little Miguel from the crib. He was frighteningly light. His fragile bones seemed like they could break with any touch. She nestled him in her arms and sat in the nursing armchair that was in the corner, an armchair that had probably never been used for its real purpose of comfort, only for decoration. With trembling hands, she adjusted her own clothing and offered her breast to the baby. For a second, Miguel, in his exhausted stupor, did not react. But then, as if a primordial instinct was awakened, he turned his little face and, with a desperate eagerness, latched on. The crying ceased the exact instant his lips found solace. The silence that followed was louder than the 3 hours of screams. The tears that Lorena had been holding back finally rolled down her face, silent and hot. They were tears of her own pain, of longing for her son, but also of an overwhelming relief. The milk that was a symbol of her loss was now the source of life for another child. She felt Miguel's small body relax against hers, the tension draining away with each swallow. In that moment, in the silence of that room, 2 broken souls met and, for an instant, felt a little less alone in the world. Gabriel ended the video conference with a smile of satisfaction. The deal was closed, a millionaire contract that further consolidated his position in the market. The irritation he had felt earlier with Miguel's incessant crying had been pushed to the back of his mind, a minor annoyance on a day of professional victory. It was the sudden and deep silence that brought him back to the reality of the house. A silence that was not of peace, but of absence. He frowned, getting up from his leather chair. Where was Adriana? Surely she should have solved the problem hours ago. With firm steps and an air of impatience, he went up the marble staircase, already preparing the lecture he would give the nanny for her inefficiency. He expected to find her exhausted, rocking a still whimpering Miguel. But as he pushed open the bedroom door without knocking, the scene that awaited him paralyzed him on the spot. It was not Adriana in the armchair. It was Lorena, the cleaning lady, the woman he barely saw, with his son in her arms, Miguel's face serene against her breast. For a long second, his brain refused to process the image. Then, incomprehension gave way to a wave of shock, followed by a cold, possessive fury. A violation. It was the only word that echoed in his mind. An employee, a stranger, in an act of unimaginable intimacy with his son. "What do you think you are doing?" Gabriel's voice came out low, but laden with a cutting anger that made the air vibrate. He took a step forward, his face a mask of contained fury. "Let go of my son, now!" Lorena startled, her body stiffening, but her protective instinct was faster. She held Miguel lightly against her, like a shield, afraid that the father's tone of voice might break the boy's fragile peace. With her eyes still teary and her voice choked with emotion and fear, she tried to explain, the words stumbling over each other. "Sir, please." He wouldn't stop crying. It had been 3 hours. Adriana disappeared. The milk in the bottle was spoiled. He was burning with fever, weak. "I didn't know what to do." As she spoke, desperate, Gabriel finally averted his gaze from her face to his son's, and what he saw hit him like a punch. Miguel was sleeping with a tranquility that he, his own father, had never been able to provide him. His small lips, stained with milk, were relaxed, and his breathing was deep and calm. Gabriel's anger began to dissolve, replaced by an uncomfortable confusion. It was then that Lorena, feeling she needed him to understand the truth behind her act, whispered the phrase that would change everything. "I lost my son 6 weeks ago, sir. I know what a suffering baby is. I couldn't." Her voice broke into a sob, and the rest of the sentence died in her throat. Gabriel's fury was completely extinguished, leaving behind only a cold void of shock and shame. Lorena's confession hung in the air like a dense fog, completely changing the atmosphere of the room. Gabriel's brain, trained to deal with numbers, strategies, and negotiations, simply did not have a protocol for this. He looked at the face of the woman in front of him, a face he admitted to himself he had never really seen before, and saw the marks of a pain so deep it scared him. The image of the invisible cleaning lady was shattered, and in her place emerged that of a grieving mother whose personal tragedy had just saved his son's life. A wave of shame hit him, hot and uncomfortable. Shame for his fury, for his neglect, for having been just a few meters away, closing a deal while his son suffered. But this shame was accompanied by an equally strong panic. Her pain was a mirror that reflected his own failings as a father, his own loneliness as a widower. It was easier to feel anger. Anger was simple, direct. This tangle of grief, gratitude, and guilt was an unknown and dangerous territory. He, a man who controlled business empires, felt completely powerless. And his instinctive reaction to powerlessness was always the same: retreat, postpone, re-establish control. With a visible effort to recompose his authority, Gabriel hardened his expression, the executive's mask settling back on his face. His voice, when he finally spoke, was devoid of any emotion, be it anger or gratitude. It was the voice of a boss giving an order, cold and distant. "Compose yourself, Lorena, and place him carefully in the crib." Each word was a barrier he erected between them, rebuilding the social wall she had dared to cross. "Go home for today. Tomorrow we'll talk about this." He could not even name what had happened. Lorena felt a chill run through her body, erasing the warmth of the moment she had lived with Miguel. The fragile bridge of humanity that had formed between them for an instant had been demolished by him. She just nodded, too exhausted to fight. With infinite care, she stood up and placed little Miguel, who was snoring peacefully, back in the crib. Her heart ached as she moved away, a silent and bitter farewell. She left the room without giving him another look, went down the staircase feeling the cold marble under her feet and the weight of his gaze on her back. As she closed the mansion's door behind her, a feeling of dread invaded her. She didn't know if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life, but she suspected that kindness in his world was a worthless currency. Adriana Silva entered the mansion through the back door well after 10 at night, moving on tiptoe like a thief. The designer bags she carried, full of new clothes and expensive makeup, were the silent proof of her afternoon of leisure, financed by the job she despised so much, but which paid too well to quit. She felt slightly euphoric, the effect of the second cocktail her friends had convinced her to drink, still present in her system. Her only concern was to get to her room without being seen by Gabriel. First, however, she needed to do a routine check in Miguel's room to keep up appearances. She went up the stairs, expecting to find the baby whimpering or, at best, sleeping a restless sleep. Upon opening the door, however, she found a silence and a peace she had never witnessed there. Miguel was sleeping deeply, his breathing so serene that she had to get closer to make sure everything was okay. The sight left her intrigued and then suspicious. How was this possible? He never slept like this. Her predator's eyes began to scan the environment, the untouched bottle with the visibly spoiled milk, the nursing armchair a centimeter out of place, and a subtle scent, a cheap floral perfume that she knew was not hers. It was Lorena's perfume. A knot of apprehension and jealousy began to form in her stomach. The cleaning lady, what was she doing in there? The next morning, Adriana's suspicion had fermented and turned into a perverse plan, born of pure panic and envy. While having her coffee in the kitchen, she replayed the facts in her mind, twisting them to fit her narrative. Lorena, the quiet and plain woman, had somehow calmed the baby that she, the professional and well-paid nanny, could not control. This was more than a simple help. It was a direct threat. The fear of losing that comfortable job, which allowed her a life she could never afford otherwise, was terrifying. What if Gabriel found out she had abandoned her post for hours? The best defense, she decided, was a brutal attack. The image of Lorena, with her humble appearance, trying to win the sympathy of the widowed and rich boss, began to take shape in her head. It was a perfect story, one that exploited all the social prejudices she knew existed. The poor and ambitious maid, trying to make a move on the lonely boss. She would not just be protecting herself, she would be destroying Lorena's reputation so completely that no one would ever believe her. With a subtle smile on her lips, she saw Donna Celia, the cook and queen of the house's gossip, enter the kitchen. Adriana knew exactly what to do. She would plant the seed there with the right person and then just watch the poison spread. Adriana prepared the ground with the skill of an experienced actress. She found Donna Celia in the kitchen, who was chopping vegetables for lunch, and approached with an expression of deep concern on her face. Donna Celia, with all due respect, I need to vent to someone trustworthy. My heart is in my hands, she began, her voice low and conspiratorial. The cook, a middle-aged woman whose ears were the house's news central, stopped what she was doing and gave her full attention. It's about Lorena, Adriana continued, feigning hesitation. I don't know. Yesterday when I arrived, I felt something strange. I went to see Miguel and she was there in the room with him in her arms. The way she looked at the boy, it wasn't normal, you know. It was an obsession, a possessive look. It gave me the creeps. Donna Celia's eyes widened, absorbing every word. And that's not all, Adriana added, delivering the final blow. Lately, she's always asking me questions about Mr. Gabriel. If he feels lonely, if he thinks about finding someone else. I feel like she has ulterior motives, taking advantage of the fact that the boss is a good and widowed man to try something. The cook put the pieces together in her head, and prejudice did the rest of the work. The image of the humble cleaning lady transformed into that of the ambitious gold digger. For Celia, the story not only made sense, it was first-class gossip. She was already thinking about who would be the first person she would tell this bombshell news to. With the poison already circulating inside the mansion, Adriana moved on to the second phase of her plan, to take the story outside, where it would gain strength and return to Gabriel as an indisputable fact. Her target was Marcia Bittencourt, the neighbor across the street, a rich, bored woman with a tongue as sharp as her social influence. On the pretext of asking for a gardener recommendation, Adriana called her, using her most servile and worried tone. "Dona Marcia, forgive my boldness, but you, as a friend of the family, needed to know. I'm so distressed about Mr. Gabriel." On the other end of the line, Marcia settled into her silk sofa, smelling a scandal. This new cleaning lady, Lorena, she's completely obsessed with little Miguel, using the child as an excuse to get close to the boss. The day I practically caught her trying to seduce him. She's an opportunist of the worst kind, Dona Marcia, taking advantage of the pain of a man who just lost his wife. For Marcia, this was a feast, a welcome entertainment in her monotonous afternoon. She barely waited for Adriana to hang up. With the phone still warm in her hand, she made the first of many calls. The first was to Gabriel's ex-mother-in-law, Miguel's grandmother. Adriana's lie, now validated by a high society source, ceased to be a rumor and became a wildfire, spreading from phone to phone through the neighborhood's mansions, each time more distorted and cruel. Gabriel was in his office the next morning, trying to concentrate on an investment spreadsheet, but the image of Lorena and Miguel wouldn't leave his head. The situation made him deeply uncomfortable, a problem with no logical solution. That's when his personal phone rang. It was Marcia Bittencourt. "Gabriel, dear, sorry to bother you, but as your neighbor and a friend of the family, I felt obliged to call," she said in a falsely sweet voice. "You need to be very careful with the people you put inside your house, especially now in such a delicate moment." He thanked her, confused, and hung up, classifying the act as pure nosiness. But 5 minutes later, another neighbor called with a similar warning, and then another. A sense of paranoia began to set in. The final blow came with the call from his ex-mother-in-law, Donna Esther. Her voice was not sweet or subtle. It was a thunder of hysteria and accusation. "Gabriel, what the hell is going on in your house? Have you lost your mind? Is the memory of my daughter, your late wife, worthless now? I just found out that you have a cleaning lady rubbing up against you, using my grandson as bait. The whole neighborhood is talking. They're saying you're naive, a fool, who let himself be tricked by the first opportunist who came along. How could you be so weak?" Donna Esther's accusations fell on Gabriel like acid. He tried to argue, to explain the real situation, but she wouldn't listen, drowning his words in more and more insults to his capacity as a father and widower. After hanging up the phone, he felt cornered, humiliated. The world he worked so hard to control was crumbling, and the epicenter of the earthquake was Lorena. In his mind, a furious battle began to be waged. On one side was the truth he had seen with his own eyes, Lorena's desperation, Miguel's fever, the peace that settled in the room after she breastfed him. A part of him, the logical and fair part, knew she had saved his son. He remembered her face, stained with tears, and her story of loss. Firing her would be a cruelty of immense proportions. On the other side, however, was the crushing weight of public opinion, of his reputation, of his wife's legacy. His mother-in-law's words echoed in his head: weak, fool, naive. He, Gabriel Ferraz, the ruthless CEO, being seen as an idiot manipulated by a maid. The shame was unbearable. Protecting Lorena would mean a war against everyone, a stain on his name. Firing her, on the other hand, would be quick, clean. It would silence the rumors, appease his late wife's family, and restore order. And in this conflict between the silent truth and the noisy scandal, Gabriel's vanity began to win over his conscience. Lorena arrived for work the next day with her heart divided between fear and a fragile hope. The sleepless night it brought her no answers, only the incessant replay of the scene in Miguel's room. She clung to the image of the baby's serene face and Gabriel's shocked expression. Perhaps, away from the emotion of the moment, he had understood the gravity of the situation. Perhaps he would call her to talk, to thank her, to acknowledge that she had done the right thing when no one else had. It was with this drop of optimism that she answered Gabriel's call to come to his office. The atmosphere, however, was icy. He did not invite her to sit. On the contrary, he remained standing behind his imposing mahogany desk, a fortress that separated him from her, reinforcing the distance between boss and employee. His eyes, which the day before showed confusion, were now hard and cold as steel. "Lorena," he began, his voice flat and rehearsed, "I thought a lot about what happened, and the only conclusion I can come to is that you took advantage of the situation in a completely unacceptable way. You crossed a professional and personal line that should never have been crossed." The words hit her like stones. The air fled from her lungs, and the hope she carried disintegrated into dust. She stared at him, her mouth agape, disbelief stamped on her face. How could he have distorted reality so much? "But your son," she managed to stammer, but he interrupted her with an impatient gesture. For him, the truth had already been rewritten. "Your behavior was manipulative and disturbing," Gabriel continued, now looking away, unable to face the pain he himself was inflicting. It was the act of a coward, sacrificing the truth to protect his own image. "I can't have someone I don't trust working in my house near my son. Therefore, you are fired, effective immediately." The word "fired" echoed in the silence of the office. Lorena felt the floor disappear from under her feet. It was not just the loss of the job, it was the nullification of her gesture, the transformation of an act of love into a crime. With a trembling but firm voice, she made one last attempt to rescue her dignity. "Mr. Gabriel, I swear on everything that is sacred, I only wanted to help. You saw the state he was in." Her plea was no longer for the job, but for the truth. His answer was the final stab, the cruelest of all. "That doesn't matter anymore. Get your things from the service area. Your payment will be deposited. And no, you will not say goodbye to Miguel. I want you to leave this house now." The prohibition from seeing the baby was an act of pure malice, the way he found to erase the connection that frightened him so much. Lorena stood paralyzed for an instant, her body trembling with the overwhelming injustice. Without saying another word, she turned. As she walked out, with dignity as her only shield, she heard a sound coming from upstairs, a sound she knew well. It was Miguel, who was beginning to cry again. The cry Lorena heard as she left was not a passing episode. It became the macabre soundtrack of the Ferraz mansion, a sharp, incessant wail that seemed to seep through the walls and floorboards, a sound ghost that haunted every room. It was no longer a cry of hunger or a dirty diaper. It was a cry of loss, of pure existential anguish. Miguel refused food with a violence that was frightening. Adriana, now with a clear field, tried to force the bottle into his mouth, but the baby would turn his face, clench his lips, and when a drop of milk invaded, he would choke or spit it all out, staining the expensive Egyptian cotton sheets. Gabriel initially tried to convince himself that it was a phase, a tantrum. "He'll get used to it," he told himself, trying to muffle the voice of conscience that whispered to him how wrong his decision had been. But the days turned into a week, and the situation only worsened. Miguel's small body began to wither. He lost the healthy glow in his skin, which became pale and flaccid. Dark circles appeared under his eyes, which barely opened, heavy, with a tiredness that sleep did not cure, as he no longer slept for more than 20 minutes at a time, always waking up in a panic-stricken start. The house, once a symbol of success, became a torture chamber where the suffering of an innocent child echoed endlessly. Desperate and furious with Adriana's incompetence, who now only whimpered in the corners saying she didn't know what to do, Gabriel fired her without a second thought. His solution, as always, was financial. He contacted the best agencies in São Paulo, paying fortunes for nannies specializing in difficult cases. The first, an Austrian lady with an impeccable resume, lasted 2 days, declaring that the boy was unreachable. The second, a child psychologist, tried music therapy and sensory stimuli, but Miguel only screamed louder, as if those efforts to cheer him up were an assault. One by one, the most renowned professionals in the country paraded through the mansion and left defeated, leaving behind an increasingly exhausted and terrified Gabriel. His son's cry was now a constant hammer in his head, forcing him to remember the only time he had seen peace on that face, in Lorena's arms. The doubt, once a seed, was now a poisonous tree growing in his chest. Finally, out of options, he took Miguel to the pediatrician, Dr. Santos. After weighing, measuring, and observing the baby's apathetic and suffering state, the doctor looked at Gabriel with a frightening gravity and said the words that sealed his terror. "Gabriel, your son's problem is not physical, it's his soul that is sick. He formed a very strong emotional bond with someone, and that connection was abruptly broken. It's a deep trauma. If we don't find a way to reverse this, his body will continue to shut down. He will need to be hospitalized, and the prognosis is not good." While Gabriel drowned in luxury and despair, Lorena's life disintegrated in silence. The dismissal was just the beginning of the fall. With the little money she had, she paid the rent for her tiny room in a boarding house on the outskirts, believing that her experience and dedication would quickly secure her a new job. What a bitter mistake. Day after day, she left at sunrise and returned long after it set, with her feet aching and her soul lighter than her empty stomach. She went to all the agencies, answered all the newspaper ads. The pattern was always the same and cruel. The interview would go well. Potential employers seemed to like her polite manner, and her calloused hands that promised hard work. But then came the fatal question: what was your last job, and why did you leave? Upon mentioning the Ferraz mansion, she would see a subtle change in the interviewer's eyes. A call would be made, and the door would close. "Unfortunately, the position has just been filled. We cannot proceed. We'll call if there's interest." After the 10th rejection, the truth hit her with the force of a punch. Gabriel had not just fired her, he had poisoned her. A single negative word from a man with that surname was enough to tarnish her name forever. She was blacklisted, condemned for a crime she did not commit. The money ran out, and with it, the boarding house owner's patience. On a grey winter morning, Lorena found herself on the sidewalk, with all her possessions reduced to 2 plastic bags and a heart heavy with injustice. The first night on the street was the most terrifying of her life. The cold of São Paulo, damp and cutting, seemed to penetrate her bones, but it was nothing compared to the cold of abandonment. Every shadow was a threat. Every sound of footsteps made her shrink into the dark corner she had found behind a church. She, who had taken care of a mansion, now did not even have a door to lock. The days that followed merged into a routine of brutal survival. Hunger became a constant companion, a pain she tried to trick with water from public fountains, or on lucky days, with bread donated by some charitable soul. Humiliation was her shadow, following her when she rummaged through a bakery's trash, or when people averted their gaze, pretending she didn't exist. She learned to sleep with one eye open, to distrust everyone, to make herself invisible to protect herself. Amidst all the despair, when the urge to simply give up became almost unbearable, one image kept her going: Miguel's face. She thought of him constantly. Was he okay? Was the new nanny patient? Did he still cry in that helpless way? The memory, of his small body relaxing in her arms, of the warmth of his life against hers, was the only good thing she had left. That act of love which had cost her everything was paradoxically the only thing that kept her from losing herself completely. The silence in the mansion was more deafening than Miguel's screams had ever been. Gabriel had just returned from the hospital, where he left his son connected to tubes and monitors. Dr. Santos's diagnosis, deep emotional trauma, echoed in his mind like a guilty sentence. He walked through the rooms like a ghost, each luxury object a reminder of his failure as a father. In Miguel's room, the empty crib was an open wound. It was in this state of torpor and self-loathing that he saw something that made no sense. Through the window of his office, which overlooked the back of the garden, he spotted a familiar figure near the service gate. It was Adriana. He had fired her weeks ago. What was she doing there? Morbid curiosity made him watch. She was whispering with a suspicious-looking man on a motorcycle, looking nervously from side to side. Gabriel saw Adriana hand the man a small box, which he recognized immediately. It was the packaging of an imported and very expensive reflux medication that Dr. Santos had prescribed for Miguel before the crisis set in. In exchange, the man handed her a wad of cash. Gabriel's brain, slow from exhaustion and remorse, took a second to process the scene. She wasn't just there, she was selling his sick son's medicine. A coldness took over his body, replacing the pain with a lucid and cutting fury. Without making a sound, Gabriel went around the house and appeared in the garden at the exact moment the motorcyclist accelerated and disappeared down the street. Adriana turned, and her face transformed into a mask of pure panic upon seeing him there, standing like a judge. She tried to hide the money in her pants pocket, but the gesture was clumsy and obvious. Gabriel's voice came out dangerously, calm, a frightening contrast to the storm in his eyes. "What were you doing, Adriana?" she stammered, trying to formulate a lie. "Mr. Gabriel, what a scare! I was selling an old perfume to an acquaintance." The excuse was so pathetic it insulted his intelligence. Gabriel's calm broke. "Don't lie to me," he roared, his voice exploding with all the accumulated pain and anger. He advanced and grabbed her arm forcefully. "I saw the box. It was my son's medicine. You were stealing from a child who is hospitalized." The combination of his fury, the pain on his face, and the certainty of being caught red-handed demolished all of Adriana's defenses. She collapsed in sobs, her body trembling uncontrollably. And amidst the tears of terror, the confession poured out like a broken sewer. "Forgive me. It was all a lie. Lorena, I made it all up. She saved his life that day. He was going to die. I was the one who left him crying. I lied that she wanted to seduce you. I was just afraid of losing my job. It was all jealousy. For the love of God, forgive me." Each word was a stab in Gabriel's chest, the cruel and absolute truth hitting him with the force of a hurricane, leaving behind only the ruin of his arrogance and the crushing weight of his catastrophic mistake. Gabriel let go of Adriana's arm, as if touching something radioactive. The sound of her confession still echoed in the garden, but in his mind he heard his own voice days ago in the office. "You took advantage, inappropriate and disturbing behavior." Every syllable he had used to destroy Lorena now ricocheted back, hitting him with the force of a projectile. A deep nausea, a physical aversion to himself, rose in his throat. He looked at the woman sobbing at his feet, but no longer saw the nanny. He saw a monster he himself had fed, a liar he chose to believe because her story was more convenient for his ego. The guilt was so overwhelming, so complete, that for a moment he felt dizzy. When he regained his voice, it was unrecognizable, hollow and lifeless. "Get out of my sight," he said, without even looking at her. "Take your things and disappear from my life. If I see you on the street, I'll cross to the other side. To me, you no longer exist." He turned and left her there, fallen on the grass, a piece of human garbage he wouldn't deign to touch. As soon as he entered the house, The torpor gave way to a feverish urgency, a single idea that took hold of every cell in his body: find Lorena. It was no longer just for Miguel, it was for him. It was the only possible penance, the only act that could begin to scratch the surface of the mountain of guilt under which he was buried. Without even changing his clothes, Gabriel grabbed his car keys and sped off. The first destination was the address on Lorena's old employee file, a boarding house in a working-class neighborhood on the other side of the city. As he drove his German sedan through streets he had never seen, the contrast between his world and hers slapped him in the face. He arrived at the location and was greeted by the boarding house owner, a suspicious lady who sized him up and down. When he asked for Lorena, the woman sighed. "Lorena? Poor girl. I kicked her out over a month ago. She wasn't paying the rent, didn't have a penny to her name, left here with only the clothes on her back." The word evicted hit Gabriel like another hammer blow to his conscience. The consequence of his act was concrete, brutal. He had not only fired her, he had thrown her onto the street. Panic began to set in. From there, he began a desperate pilgrimage. He spent the rest of the day and the entire night in a blur of movement and anxiety. He went to employment agencies, to hospitals asking for women admitted without documents, to homeless shelters. In each of these places, he, with his expensive suit and luxury watch, was an alien, an intruder in the world of misery he himself had helped create. And in every tired and suffering face he saw, he searched for Lorena, with the growing terror that he might never find her again. 4 days passed, 4 days in which Gabriel did not sleep, barely ate, and lived on coffee, guilt, and a desperate adrenaline. His very expensive suit was wrinkled and dirty, his unshaven beard gave him a crazed look, and his eyes were sunken and red. He had transformed into a spectre, haunting the darkest corners of the city, with a photo of Lorena in his hand, repeating her name like a mantra. The news from the hospital was getting worse. Miguel was not responding to any stimuli, was losing weight dangerously, and the doctors were beginning to talk about organ failure. Time was running out on 2 fronts. That night, exhausted and almost without hope, he was in an area under a viaduct downtown, a place that reeked of urine and despair, showing the photo to the homeless people warming themselves around a burning drum. When he showed it to an older man, with a white beard and kind eyes named João, something changed. The man did not shake his head immediately. He took the photo, brought it closer to the fire, and his eyes narrowed. "I know her," he said, his voice hoarse. "She's the girl with the sad eyes. Stayed around here for a few weeks, quiet, didn't bother anyone." Gabriel's heart leapt. "Where is she? Do you know?" João sighed, a heavy sound. "Haven't seen her much for a couple of days. She was coughing a lot, mister. A nasty cough. It hurt just to hear it. Last time she could barely stand. I think she went to hide from the wind over there." He pointed to the deepest darkness of the viaduct. "Where it's deeper." With João's directions burning in his mind, Gabriel plunged into the darkness under the concrete. The smell of mold and rot was suffocating. He turned on his phone's flashlight, the beam of light dancing across the graffitied walls and revealing piles of garbage and filthy mattresses. His heart hammered against his ribs, a mix of hope of finding her and terror of what he might find. He called her name, first low, then louder. "Lorena?" A faint moan answered, coming from a pile of cardboard and a grimy blanket in one of the darkest corners. He approached and pointed the light. The sight that greeted him made his blood run cold and his knees go weak. It was her, but a version framed by death. She was skeletal, the skin on her face stretched over her bones with a cadaverous pallor. Her lips were blue and cracked, and her eyes, sunken and glazed with fever, opened with difficulty. She was trembling violently, despite the stuffy heat of the place, and each breath was a painful wheeze, interrupted by a deep, hollow cough that shook her fragile body. She looked at the light, at the silhouette of the well-dressed man, and did not recognize him. In her delirium, she saw only a threat. With a moan of terror, she tried to crawl further away. That sound, the fear she felt of him, was the final punishment, the living and agonizing proof of the depth of the evil he had committed. Seeing the terror in Lorena's eyes, Gabriel felt as if his heart was being crushed. He took a step back, lowering the phone's light so as not to scare her further. In a gesture he never imagined making, he knelt on the filthy floor of that underworld, the expensive fabric of his pants getting stained with mud and misery, leveling himself with the woman he had destroyed. "Lorena, please, it's me, Gabriel." His voice came out choked, a broken whisper. "Don't be afraid of me. I know everything. I found out the truth." In a stream of desperate words, he poured the whole story out to her. He told her about Adriana selling the medicine, about the confession in the garden, about the web of lies and jealousy. He did not spare himself, confessing his own vanity, his cowardice, his arrogance in believing the rumor that massaged his ego. "I was the worst of men, Lorena. I accused you, humiliated you, and threw you onto the street for a whim, to protect my stupid reputation. There is no forgiveness for what I did. I know that." The tears he had been holding back for days finally came, rolling down his dirty, bearded face. "But I'm not here to ask for forgiveness for myself," he continued, his voice rising in desperation. "It's Miguel. Lorena, he's dying. He's hospitalized. He doesn't eat. He doesn't react to anything. The doctors say he's giving up on life. They said it was because the strongest bond he had was broken. The bond with you. He needs you, Lorena. I'm begging you, not for me, but for my son's life. Please, save him again." Gabriel's words entered Lorena's feverish mind like fragments of a distant and confusing dream. His voice seemed to come from far away, distorted by the wheezing in her chest and the pain that throbbed in her head. But a few phrases cut through the fog of her illness with the clarity of a razor. "Adriana lied. Miguel is dying. He needs you." She looked at the kneeling figure before her. It was the man who was the cause of all her misfortune, the architect of her personal hell. Hatred, a feeling she thought had been frozen by hunger and cold, threatened to awaken. Distrust was a wild animal in her chest, telling her to scream, telling her to send him away. But then the image of little Miguel invaded her consciousness, his fragile weight in her arms, the sound of his breathing calming down, the way his little fingers clutched her. Iblaus, that feeling, that connection was more real and stronger than her own pain. Saving that life had been the last truly good thing she had done in the world. How could she deny him that now? Her anger against Gabriel was immense, but her love for that baby was infinite. With a monumental effort, she managed to nod her head in an almost imperceptible gesture. Her voice, when it came out, was a wisp of sound, a whisper the wind almost carried away. "Only for the boy, only for Miguel." Hearing that, a sob of pure relief escaped Gabriel. Without hesitation, he took off his own jacket, a designer piece worth a fortune, and wrapped her in it. With infinite care, as if carrying the most precious object in the world, he lifted her into his arms. She was frighteningly light, and so he carried her out of the darkness, a first and faltering step towards the light. Gabriel's entrance into the emergency room of the most expensive hospital in the city was a scene of chaos and astonishment. He burst through the automatic doors, his designer suit dirty with mud, his beard unshaven, carrying in his arms a skeletal and half-naked woman, wrapped only in a stained jacket. The looks of shock and curiosity from other patients and staff were immediate, but the medical team acted with impersonal efficiency. Within minutes, Lorena was taken to an emergency room, where a quick diagnosis confirmed Gabriel's worst fears: severe bacterial pneumonia, acute malnutrition, and a state of critical dehydration. She was immediately admitted, connected to an IV that infused her with saline, antibiotics, and vitamins. An oxygen mask was placed over her face to help her lungs fight. For Gabriel, the next few hours were torture. He refused to go home, turning the waiting room into his personal purgatory. He alternated vigils, moving from the door of the ICU where Lorena fought for her life to the incubator in the neonatal ICU where his son also waged a silent battle. He became a well-known and talked-about figure among the nurses, the tormented millionaire, whose fate seemed inexplicably linked to that of the woman he had rescued from the underworld and to his own son. For 3 days, he lived in this limbo, ignoring business, the outside world, feeding only on guilt and the fragile hope that it was not too late for both of them. On the 3rd day, a miracle began to take shape. Lorena, responding to the medication, was out of danger, though still very weak. She was breathing with less difficulty, and the fever had subsided. Seeing her improvement and Miguel's continuous and dangerous decline, Dr. Santos, after a long and humiliating conversation with Gabriel, where the whole truth was exposed, made an unorthodox decision. "Let's try," he said, more like a scientist testing a last hypothesis than a confident doctor. Lorena was taken in a wheelchair to the neonatal ICU. The atmosphere was one of silence and tension. The nurses watched, skeptical. Gabriel shrank into a corner, feeling like a useless spectator in the drama he himself had written. Miguel was in his incubator, pale, motionless, looking smaller than ever. With the doctor's permission, Lorena leaned over, her still gaunt face close to the acrylic, and with a weak and hoarse voice she whispered, "Miguel, my dear, it's me, Lo. Mommy came to see you." In that instant, the impossible happened. Miguel's tiny body, which had not reacted to anything for weeks, shuddered. His head turned slowly in the direction of the voice. His eyelids, previously heavy, trembled and opened. And then, as Lorena continued to whisper words of love, the corners of the baby's lips curved upwards in the first smile in an eternity. A collective sob was heard from the nurses. Gabriel collapsed against the wall, tears running freely. With a nod from the doctor, a nurse placed Miguel in Lorena's arms. Nestled there, he accepted the bottle that was offered to him and began to suck eagerly, his eyes fixed on the face of the woman who was, undeniably, his safe harbor. A week later, the day of hospital discharge arrived. Miguel, although still in need of care, was a transformed child. He had regained weight, his cry was the normal cry of a baby, and his eyes followed Lorena's every move with an adoration that was the living testimony of their connection. Lorena, for her part, was physically cured of pneumonia, but her soul carried scars that no antibiotic could heal. She moved with a heavy quietness, a reserve that was an armor against the world and especially against the man who now orchestrated her return. The journey from the hospital to the mansion was one of the longest of Gabriel's life. He drove the luxury car, while in the back seat, Lorena devoted herself entirely to Miguel, who was safe in his new car seat. Her hand rested constantly on the boy's leg, a gesture of instinctive protection. She did not look forward once. Gabriel watched her through the rearview mirror, his heart tight, his mouth dry with the 1,000 apologies he wanted to offer, but that would sound empty and pathetic. As they passed through the imposing gates of the mansion, Lorena felt a shiver. The last time she had left through there, she had been expelled like a criminal, with the sound of Miguel's crying as her farewell soundtrack. Now she was returning in the boss's car, with the same baby in her arms, in an undefined and dangerous role. That place was not her home. It was the stage of her greatest humiliation. Gabriel led her not to the service wing, but to a spacious and elegant guest suite upstairs next to Miguel's room. "I thought it would be better for you to stay here, closer to him. It has everything you need," he said, his voice sounding strange and formal in his own house. Lorena just thanked him with a nod, without looking at him, and murmured, "A thank you, Mr. Gabriel." The use of the word "Mr." was like a slap in his face, a subtle and powerful reminder of the distance she would make sure to maintain. From that moment on, life in the mansion began to follow a set of unwritten rules, all established by her. Lorena's universe was reduced to Miguel, She cared for him with total devotion, her world filled with bottles, baths, lullabies, and sleepless nights in an armchair next to the crib, ignoring the soft and inviting bed. Between her and Gabriel, there was an invisible but insurmountable wall. She only addressed him to discuss matters strictly related to the baby, her phrases short and objective. His vaccination is on Tuesday. The diaper rash cream ran out. If he entered the room where she was with Miguel, she would find an excuse to retreat to her room. She never ate at the table with him, waiting for him to finish to have her meal in the kitchen, like in the old days. For Gabriel, this was a form of silent torture. He would have preferred screams and accusations to that polite indifference, the cold punishment of a woman who didn't even give him the opportunity to ask for forgiveness. The news of Lorena's return spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. It didn't take long for the mansion's phone to ring. It was Marcia Bittencourt, with her voice of silk and venom. "Gabriel, dear, good thing you answered. I heard about the news," she began with a false intimacy. "I'm only calling because I'm concerned. Bringing that woman back after everything, don't you think it's dangerous? Your family's reputation, the memory of your wife." The last time words like these had paralyzed him with shame. Now they only ignited a cold, controlled fury. Gabriel interrupted her, his voice as sharp as broken glass. "Marcia, her name is Lorena, and the everything you're referring to was a disgusting slander, spread by idle and malicious people like you. This woman, whom you treat with such disdain, saved my son's life on 2 separate occasions, correcting mistakes that I made. The first, out of negligence. The second, for being an idiot who listened to gossip. My family's reputation at this moment depends on me fixing the injustice I caused her. Therefore, this is the last time you call my house to talk about this matter. If it happens again, I will not hesitate to take legal action for harassment." He slammed the phone down in her face, the sound of the click echoing in the silence of the office. It was a small act, but for him it felt like a monumental victory. He was, for the first time, fighting the right battle. A few days later, as a fragile routine of peace began to settle in, a new threat from the past emerged. The house's landline rang, and as Lorena was in the garden with Miguel, Gabriel answered. On the other end, a masculine voice, slurred and aggressive, asked for her. "Who would like to speak?" Gabriel asked, his instinct already on alert. "It's Ricardo, her ex-husband. I heard the sly one got lucky, huh? Hooked a rich widower. Always was a clever one," said the man with a tone of mockery and greed. "Look here, I know a lot of things about Lorena, some dirty secrets she wouldn't like a fine man like you to know. If you want the image of your new protégé to remain clean, I think we can reach an agreement. A little financial help to keep my mouth shut, you understand." Gabriel's blood boiled. The idea of another man, a worm like that, trying to profit from Lorena's pain and humiliation was the last straw. His response was immediate and lethal. "Listen here, Ricardo, or whatever your name is. Pay close attention. Lorena's past life is no longer your concern. If you dare to call this number again, if you dare to come within a kilometer of this house, or if her name leaves your filthy mouth to any journalist, I will not call the police. I will use every penny I have and every contact I possess to make sure you regret being born. I will hunt you down in your business, in your personal life, and I will destroy you in a way you can't even imagine is possible. Disappear." He slammed the phone hard on the cradle. Lorena, who was entering the room at that moment, only heard the end of the noise. Gabriel said nothing. That was a burden he would carry for her, one of the many debts he was beginning silently to pay. The weeks passed, and a new normality, fragile and tense, settled in the mansion. Miguel flourished, each smile and each babble a proof of Lorena's care. However, Gabriel realized that his efforts to protect Lorena were like trying to contain a hemorrhage with a small bandage. He saw the truth in the shadows, in the pitying look of a delivery man, in the whisper of a gardener, in the way Lorena shrank when someone looked at her for too long. He had cleared the ground around him, but the poison of gossip still contaminated the air. He realized with painful clarity that to erase a lie spoken aloud, the truth needed to be shouted. The idea that formed in his mind was radical and terrifying, going against all his instincts as a discreet and controlling businessman. He needed to go public. He needed to confess his failure, his weakness, his injustice for the whole world to see. His image consultants would call him crazy. His family would condemn him. But then he looked at Lorena, who moved through the house with the silent grace of someone who had survived hell, and at Miguel, who now giggled in her lap, and he understood that his reputation was an insignificant price to pay. That night, after the whole house had fallen asleep, he sat in front of his computer, not as CEO Gabriel Ferraz, but as a man in search of absolution, and began to write. He spared no details, nor himself. The text that emerged was a raw confession, an autopsy of his own character. He described the 3 hours of his son's crying, his own negligence in prioritizing a meeting, Lorena's heroic and desperate act. He openly admitted how the malicious gossip had found fertile ground in his vanity and his fear of appearing weak. "I did not fire an employee for inappropriate behavior," he wrote. "I expelled a heroine for showing me what a terrible father I was being. I chose to believe a comfortable lie over an inconvenient truth, and with that, I almost destroyed the life of an innocent woman and that of my own son." He continued, each word a hammer blow to his old public image. "Lorena Núñez did not try to seduce me. She is not an opportunist. She is a grieving mother who, in an act of the purest compassion, saved a child abandoned by his nanny and ignored by his father. What followed, her dismissal, her eviction, her life on the streets, was not an accident. It was the direct result of my cowardice." He ended with a public apology directed at her and a declaration. "The debt I owe her is unpayable, and for that reason I want you to know that she is no longer a stranger in my house. She is my son's guardian and the heart of this family." With a trembling finger he clicked, "Publish." The next morning, he did not wake up to his alarm, but to the incessant buzzing of his cell phone. The post had exploded. Thousands of shares, hundreds of thousands of reactions. The story had left the bubble of his neighborhood and become a viral phenomenon, gracing the headlines of the country's biggest news portals. Lorena didn't have social media. Her life was an analog universe of baby bottles, diapers, and the sound of Miguel's breathing. She learned of the storm that had formed around her through Donna Celia. The cook, who since Lorena's return had treated her with a guilty reverence, approached her in the kitchen with her cell phone in hand and wide eyes. "Girl, for God's sake, you have to see this. The boss. He told everything." Lorena took the device with trembling hands and began to read. With each paragraph, the air seemed to become thinner. To see her pain, her humiliation, her rescue, and her fall described with such brutal honesty and exposed to the world was a shock that made her dizzy. It was a violation of her privacy, but at the same time, it was the deepest and most complete validation she could imagine. The tears came, but this time they were not of pain or sadness. They were of a complex and indescribable emotion, a mixture of relief, shame, and a reluctant admiration. That man, in his arrogance, had destroyed her. Now, in an act of public self-flagellation, he was rebuilding her. Later, she found him in the office, an exhausted man in the midst of a storm of calls. For the first time, she broke the rule of silence. "Why?" she asked, her voice low but firm. "Why expose yourself like that?" Gabriel hung up the phone and faced her. Because the lie was a whisper that became a roar. The truth needed to be a shout to silence it. "I owed that to you, Lorena." The wall between them did not fall, but for the first time, a small crack opened. Gabriel's shout of truth became a media storm. The story had all the elements of a real-life soap opera. widowed millionaire, an unlikely heroine, an envious villain, a terrible injustice, and finally, a dramatic redemption. In less than 24 hours, the front of the mansion turned into a camp for news crews. Cameras with huge lenses pointed at the gates, waiting for a glimpse of the protagonists of the story that had stopped Brazil. Gabriel, overwhelmed, hired a press advisory with a single instruction: to refuse all invitations. His goal was to clear Lorena's name, not to create a circus. However, one invitation stood out. It was from one of the most respected journalism programs on Brazilian television, known for its long, serious interviews. The production wanted an exclusive conversation with both of them, Gabriel and Lorena. Gabriel's first reaction was a resounding no. He would not subject Lorena to this scrutiny. He went to her, who was watching the reporter's movement through the window, to communicate his decision to protect her. "They want an interview. I'm going to have it." "Refused, don't worry." But to his surprise, Lorena turned and looked at him with a new determination in her eyes. "I want to go," she said. Gabriel was shocked. "Lorena, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she interrupted him, her voice calm, but full of a strength he had never seen before. "But I want to. They heard the gossipers' version, and they heard your version. Now I want them to hear my story in my voice." At that moment, Gabriel understood that she was no longer just a victim to be protected. She was taking the reins of her own narrative. The day of the interview arrived with a charge of electricity in the air. A black, discreet car from the station picked them up, crossing the mansion's gate under the flashes of photographers who were still standing guard. Lorena was dressed with a simplicity that was, in itself, a statement of power. She wore a navy blue dress with a straight cut and modest fabric, which she herself had bought with the first salary. Gabriel insisted on depositing, retroactive to her entire period of absence. There was no jewelry, only the dignity in her posture. She was serene, with a calmness that came from someone who had already faced the worst and survived. Gabriel, in contrast, was a bundle of nerves. He, the CEO accustomed to speeches and presentations, adjusted his tie every minute, his hands sweating coldly. His fear was not of his own image, which he had already voluntarily destroyed. It was the fear of, with one wrong word, causing Lorena more pain. He was not the protagonist there. He was a witness, a supporting piece for her story. Upon arriving at the studio, they were enveloped in an environment of cold professionalism. The blinding lights, the cameras that looked like giant insect eyes, the crew that moved in silence and with efficiency. They sat in the designated armchairs, under the attentive gaze of the interviewer, one of the most respected journalists in the country. The silence that preceded the start of the recording was dense, charged with expectation. The interview began with Gabriel. The journalist was direct but not aggressive. "Mr. Ferraz, in your post, you described yourself as a coward and arrogant. What would you say today?" Gabriel swallowed hard, looked at the camera as if he were looking at every person who had read his story, and spoke with a choked voice. "I would say I was generous with myself. What I did was cruel. There is no other word. I failed my son, whom I swore to protect, and I failed Lorena, to whom I owed the greatest of gratitudes. I exchanged truth for convenience, and the price of that mistake was almost the lives of two people. My regret does not change what I did, but perhaps it can serve as a lesson." Then all eyes turned to Lorena. The journalist addressed her with a remarkable gentleness. "Lorena, Brazil was moved by your story, but no one knows what you felt. What was going through your mind when you were accused and fired?" She took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and firm, without a hint of self-pity. "That day, I felt a lot of pain, not for losing my job, but for seeing an act of care be turned into something ugly. On the street, I felt cold, hunger, fear, but at no moment did I regret what I did." The journalist insisted, "You don't feel anger, a desire for revenge." Lorena looked directly at the camera. and her next words silenced the country. Anger wouldn't bring my job back. Revenge wouldn't warm my nights on the street. I lost almost everything because of a lie, but the only thing that mattered, the only thing that kept me standing, was knowing that because of me, Miguel was alive. And he is. That, for me, is the only victory that counts. Her grace in the face of tragedy was disconcerting. Gabriel looked at her, not with pity, but with an admiration that bordered on devotion. He was in the presence of a force he would never be able to fully comprehend. If Gabriel's post was a storm, Lorena's interview was a tidal wave. Her serene dignity, the total absence of bitterness, transformed her from a victim into an icon of resilience. Brazil not only sympathized with her, Brazil admired her. Offers poured in from everywhere: jobs, donations, apartments, invitations to speak. The same socialites who had defamed her, like Marcia Bittencourt, became pariahs, the targets of public contempt. The trip back from the studio was marked by a new kind of silence. It was not tense or heavy, but reflective. Gabriel, who was driving, was the first to speak, his voice full of a genuine admiration she had never heard before. "Lorena, what you did tonight, your courage, your strength, it was the most impressive thing I have ever witnessed in my entire life." For the first time, Lorena did not shrink or look away. She faced him through the rearview mirror and offered a small but genuine smile. "I just told my truth." And then, in a move that surprised them both, she extended a bridge over the chasm that separated them. "And you? Was it very hard to admit all of that in front of millions of people?" The question, a simple act of acknowledging his sacrifice, changed everything. He was no longer just the executioner. He was someone who had also stripped himself bare in public. "It was the hardest and the rightest thing I've ever done," he answered honestly. In that exchange, the ice didn't just crack, it began to melt. In the weeks that followed, the healing came not in grand gestures, but in a succession of small, everyday miracles. The wall of formality that Lorena had built began to be dismantled, brick by brick. One night, Gabriel arrived late from work and found her asleep in the armchair in Miguel's room, with the baby sleeping peacefully in a bassinet beside her. Instead of retreating so as not to disturb her, he took a blanket and carefully covered her, his gaze lingering on the scene for a moment, feeling a peace he had not known for a long time. On issue, another occasion while they were trying to get Miguel to eat his first vegetable puree, the boy sneezed, sending carrot puree onto both of their faces. The initial surprise gave way to a simultaneous, loud and genuine laugh. Their eyes met, and in that shared laughter, they were not the boss and the caregiver, but two adults, accomplices in the chaotic adventure of raising a baby. Gradually, she stopped eating in the kitchen and agreed to sit at the table with him. The conversations were simple, about the weather, about Miguel's new habit of clapping his hands, but they were conversations, and perhaps most significantly of all, Lorena stopped calling him Mr. One day, simply while recounting something funny the boy had done, she said, "Today Gabriel arrived and he gave the biggest smile." The word, spoken so naturally, sounded to him like the sweetest of absolutions. Time, the best of healers, wove a new reality in the mansion. The months turned into a year. Miguel was no longer a baby in arms, but a mischievous toddler who staggered around the house, his first steps taken towards Lorena's open arms. His first word, to her delight and a pang of amused jealousy in Gabriel, was "Lo." The house, once a silent mausoleum, was now filled with laughter, the noise of toys and the music of lullabies. The relationship between Lorena and Gabriel deepened into a solid friendship, founded on mutual respect and the shared love for Miguel. However, in the silent hours of the night, when Lorena watched Miguel sleep, an old insecurity began to cast a shadow over her heart. Despite the peace they lived in, the law was cold and blind. In the eyes of the world, she was nothing to him. One day, at the playground, another mother approached and said with a smile, "Wow, your son is beautiful. He takes after you." Lorena felt a lump in her throat and could only manage an awkward smile, neither confirming nor denying. That small incident was a trigger. What if something happened to Gabriel? What if his late wife's family decided in the future to claim custody? What if he fell in love again with a woman who didn't want her around? She had already lost one son to fate. The idea of losing Miguel to a signature on a piece of paper was a terror that stole her sleep. She understood that for her soul to be at peace, love needed a last name. The bond needed a document. She chose the moment carefully. On a quiet evening after putting Miguel to bed, she found Gabriel reading in his office. Her heart was pounding, afraid that her request would be misinterpreted, seen as a demand or a sign of distrust. She sat in the chair in front of him, her hands clasped in her lap. "Gabriel," she began, her voice a little shaky. "First, I want you to know that I trust you. After everything, I've learned to trust you again. I know that you would never, ever push me away from Miguel." He watched her attentively, sensing the importance of the moment. "But," she continued, taking courage, "I'm afraid of the world, not of you. I'm afraid of accidents, of unforeseen events, of the laws that don't understand what we've been through here. Miguel, he is the son my soul adopted the day I held him in my arms, and my biggest fear is that someday, for some reason, the law might separate us." The tears she had held back for so long welled up in her eyes. "That's why I wanted to ask you something, the most important request of my life. I wanted to know if you would give me the honor, the permission, to start the process to legally adopt Miguel, to be his mother on paper, as I already am in every piece of my heart." Gabriel was silent, completely stunned, not by the audacity of the request, but by its beauty, by its depth. He saw in it not a doubt about him, but the purest and most fierce declaration of maternal love a son could receive. He stood up, walked around the desk, knelt in front of her, and taking her hands, said with a choked voice, "Lorena, you don't need my permission. You are his mother, and there would be no greater honor for me than to make that official. Yes, 1,000 times yes." The path to adoption was a journey through the bureaucracy of love. They hired the best family law attorney, a woman who, upon hearing the story, waived half of her fees and embraced the cause with a personal passion. The process, which for many is a labyrinth of paperwork and frustration, became for them a ritual of healing. In the interviews with the social worker, they sat side by side and retold everything. Gabriel, without shying away, narrated his arrogance and his redemption. Lorena, with a firm voice, spoke of the loss of her first son and the rebirth of her maternal instinct with Miguel. With every document signed, every form filled out, it was as if they were rewriting the past, replacing the pages of pain and injustice with pages of commitment and truth. The day in court was the climax. Before a judge with a stern but fair gaze, they presented their case. The prosecutor, who had read the file and watched the TV interview, gave a favorable opinion with an emotional speech about the different forms that love and family can take. The judge looked at the three of them: Gabriel, the father who learned to love; Lorena, the mother his soul chose; and Miguel, who was playing with a toy car on Lorena's lap, oblivious to the solemnity that was sealing his fate. As she banged the gavel, the judge smiled. "I grant the unilateral adoption. Let the new name of the minor be recorded as Miguel Núñez Ferraz." The sound of that gavel was not the end of a process, but the big bang of a new family, now official in the eyes of God and men. The final scene of this story does not take place in a courtroom or a TV studio, but on a Sunday morning, months later, in the sunny garden of the mansion. Gabriel, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, is on the lawn, teaching a now chatty and confident Miguel how to kick a soccer ball. He is no longer the absent CEO. He is a present father who throws himself on the grass, who tickles, who celebrates a crooked kick as if it were a goal in a championship final. In a wicker chair, under the shade of a flowering ipé tree, Lorena watches them, a cup of coffee in her hands, and a serene smile on her face. The narrator who accompanied her on her journey of pain now sees her at peace. She remembers the cold nights under the viaduct, the hunger, the humiliation. The memories still exist, but they no longer hurt. They are the stone foundations upon which she has built this new and unlikely castle. The love she found was not that of a romantic fairy tale, but something perhaps rarer and stronger. The unconditional love of a son and the loyal partnership of a man who remade himself to be worthy of her. Miguel finally tires of the ball and runs with his wobbly little legs, not to Gabriel, but to her, hugging her legs and shouting a resounding, "Mommy!" She picks him up, covers him with kisses, and settles him on her lap. Gabriel approaches, sits on the grass at her feet, and rests his hand on her knee, a gesture of complicity and affection. The three of them together, under the morning sun. Not perfect, not a cliché, just a family, real, imperfect, and finally complete. 2 more years passed. Miguel, now almost 4, was a little dynamo of energy and joy, the solar center around which Lorena and Gabriel orbited in a dance of harmony and affection. The mansion, once a stage for sorrows and intrigues, had transformed into a genuine home. The wounds of the past, though not forgotten, had healed, becoming part of the foundation of their story. It was on a Tuesday afternoon that a ghost from the past knocked on the door, not physically but through a phone call. It was Donna Esther, the mother of Gabriel's late wife, Miguel's maternal grandmother. The voice, which Gabriel remembered as an instrument of hysteria and accusation, was now fragile, hesitant, and laden with a palpable loneliness. "Gabriel," she said, as if afraid he would hang up. I know I don't have the right, but I've been following through photos, news. I see how happy my grandson is, how beautiful he is." She paused, and Gabriel heard the sound of a shaky breath. "His birthday is coming up. I just wanted to know if I could send a gift, or maybe just see him, from a distance for 5 minutes. I need to see my daughter's face in him one more time." "I was a fool, Gabriel. I was cruel, blinded by grief and prejudice, and regret has been my only companion." Gabriel felt a knot in his stomach. Part of him, the part that remembered the pain that woman had caused Lorena, wanted to say no and hang up the phone forever. But another part, the father's part, thought of Miguel. He thought of his son's right to have a history, to know the roots of the mother he never met. He knew this was not a decision he could make alone. That night, he told Lorena about the call, exposing his conflicting feelings and ending with the phrase that had become the pillar of their relationship. "The final decision is yours. You are his mother. Whatever you decide, I will be by your side." Lorena was silent for a long time, processing. She remembered the humiliation, the way that woman's words relayed by Gabriel had condemned her. It would be easy and fair to refuse, to protect her sanctuary from any disturbance. But then she looked at a photo of Miguel on the shelf, his smile identical to hers, but his eyes with a sparkle that, according to Gabriel, belonged to his first wife. She realized that denying that meeting would not be an act of self-protection, but of deprivation. It would deprive Miguel of a part of his heritage. With the wisdom that life had taught her the hard way, she made her decision. "He has the right to know his grandmother," she said, her voice calm and sure. "But it will be here, in our home, on our territory, and we will both be with him the whole time. Let's start slow." Gabriel looked at her, and the admiration he felt for her, which he thought was already infinite, grew even more. The Saturday of the visit arrived, laden with the weight of years of unresolved history. The mansion, normally a place of laughter and tranquility, was tense. Gabriel paced back and forth in the living room, a nervousness he hadn't felt since the day of the interview. Lorena, on the other hand, displayed a calmness that was almost an armor. She was preparing juice for Miguel in the kitchen, her movements precise and controlled, but inside her heart was on alert. It was a test for the peace she had fought so hard to build. When the doorbell rang, the sound seemed to echo throughout the house. Gabriel took a deep breath and opened the door. Donna Esther stood on the threshold, looking 10 years older than he remembered. She was thinner, her shoulders stooped, and she held a large, clumsy gift wrapped in paper with little cars on it. Her eyes scanned the entryway, a place she knew well from her daughter's time, but which now seemed like foreign territory. At that moment, Lorena emerged from the living room, with Miguel holding firmly onto her hand. The two women, the one who accused and the one who was accused, faced each other for the first time. The air grew heavy, dense. In Donna Esther's eyes, Gabriel saw a wave of shame so deep it made the woman's face blush. She looked at Lorena, at the dignity in her posture, at the way Miguel's little hand clung to her, and whispered, her voice choked and almost inaudible, "Lorena, please forgive me." Lorena did not respond with words of forgiveness, which would have seemed easy and false. Instead, she offered something more valuable, a gesture of peace. She tilted her head slightly, and her voice came out soft, without a trace of accusation. "Donna Esther, welcome. Please come in." Miguel was curious to meet his grandmother. With a gentle nudge, she guided the boy forward. Miguel, oblivious to all the adult drama, saw only two things: a lady with sad eyes and a huge, promising gift. He pointed his little finger and, with the irrefutable logic of a nearly 4-year-old, said, "Grandma, is that mine?" The innocence of the question broke the tension like a spell. Donna Esther let out a laugh that was half a sob and knelt on the floor with difficulty, helping her grandson tear the paper. It was a beautiful wooden train. As Miguel concentrated on connecting the wagons, his grandmother watched him, tears now streaming freely down her face, silent and constant. They were tears of grief for the daughter she lost, but also of gratitude for the grandson she was, somehow, rediscovering. Lorena and Gabriel watched from a distance. Seeing the scene, the genuine pain on Esther's face, Lorena felt the last knot of resentment in her chest loosen. She got up, went to the kitchen, and returned with a tray with coffee, cake, and a glass of juice for Miguel. By offering a cup of coffee to her son's grandmother, the simple gesture of hospitality sealed a truce. In that act, a new and fragile bridge was beginning to be built over the ruins of the past. Donna Esther's first visit was the seed of a new routine. What began as a tense and rigidly supervised meeting on Saturdays gradually transformed into a family ritual. Each week, the formality lessened a little more. On the third visit, Esther brought a homemade cornmeal cake, her late daughter's favorite recipe, and shared it with Lorena and Gabriel at the kitchen table, while Miguel smeared his fingers in the frosting. On the fifth visit, Gabriel, sensing the calm, excused himself to take a work call, leaving the two women alone with the child for the first time. The initial silence was broken by Miguel, who insisted that his grandmother and mother sit on the floor to play with his wooden train. And there, on the living room rug, surrounded by tracks and colorful wagons, the barriers began to crumble for good. Esther started asking about Lorena's life, not out of curiosity, but out of a genuine interest in getting to know the woman who was shaping her grandson's character. Lorena, in turn, began to see beyond the figure who had wronged her, seeing a lonely grandmother desperately trying to hold on to the only part of her daughter she had left. Esther's presence in the house ceased to be an event and became just part of the weekend, a normality that no one would have dared to predict. Months before, the moment that sealed the definitive peace between them came on a rainy afternoon. Miguel was sleeping the deep sleep of the just, and Gabriel was locked in his office. Esther had brought an old photo album with her, and the two were flipping through it in the living room. The images showed Gabriel's first wife in all her stages, a chubby baby, a child in a school uniform, a smiling teenager. Stopping at a photo of her on her wedding day, Esther's eyes filled with water. She looked so happy. She had so many dreams, she whispered, her voice choked with the pain that never goes away. Seeing that pure sadness, Lorena felt a wave of empathy so strong that it compelled her to share her own pain, a secret that few knew. "I had a son too," she said, her voice low but clear in the silence of the room. "A little boy. He was born very sick and lived only 5 days." Donna Esther raised her face, her eyes wide with shock. In that instant, the dynamic between them changed. Forever. They were no longer the ex-mother-in-law and the caregiver. They were two women from different worlds, united by the most universal and piercing of pains, that of a mother who outlived her child. Esther extended a trembling hand across the table and covered Lorena's. "My dear," she said, her tears now of a mutual understanding, "and even with this pain in your chest you found the strength to love my grandson with such purity. What I did, my judgment, there is no forgiveness." Lorena squeezed her hand back and replied with the serenity that had become her trademark. "We both know what it's like to lose, Donna Esther. The only thing that matters now is what we have both gained." At that exact moment, from the next room, came the sound of Miguel stirring and calling softly for Mommy. The two women turned simultaneously towards the voice, a shared instinct, a common love that finally united them. The morning of Miguel's first day of preschool was a scene of happy and moving, domestic chaos. Lorena, with her heart tight with the emotion of seeing her little boy grow up, checked the small backpack for the 10th time, ensuring that the snack, the juice, and a little toy for emergencies were there. Her eyes teared up every time she looked at Miguel, who was wearing his new uniform, looking like a serious and anxious little man. Gabriel, for his part, had taken on the role of comic relief, making faces and jokes to dispel his son's nervousness and his mother's emotion. He knelt to tie Miguel's shoes, and the narrator, who knows his thoughts, saw there not a mundane act, but a small personal miracle. He remembered the time when he barely knew how to hold his own son, and now every detail of fatherhood was a source of deep joy. In that small morning ritual, their roles as parents were perfectly defined. Lorena was the safe harbor, the emotional center. Gabriel was the strong and gentle partner, the lighthouse that ensured the sea was always calm. They were a team tuned by experience and cemented by love. When they arrived at the school, the three of them walked hand in hand to the classroom door. Some other parents recognized them, their faces a mixture of curiosity and respect. There were no more malicious whispers or judgmental looks. Their story, which was once a scandal, had become a kind of local legend, a moral tale about error and redemption. Lorena and Gabriel were no longer the rich man and the ex-cleaning lady. They were simply Miguel's parents, a title they both wore with the greatest pride. After a tight hug from his mother and a high five with his father, Miguel ran inside, attracted by a box of colorful blocks. Before diving into play, he looked back, gave a toothless smile and waved, shouting in his childish, crystal-clear voice, "Bye, Mommy! Bye, Daddy!" The word "daddy," said so naturally, hit Gabriel hard, a gift he felt he would never finish deserving. His eyes filled with tears and, without thinking, Lorena intertwined her fingers with his, a gesture of complicity and support. As they walked away from the school gate, side by side, the touch of their hands said everything. They were a team, a united front, parents in every sense of the word. The happiness Lorena found did not make her forget the path she had traveled. The cold nights on the street, the anonymous faces of other women in desperate situations, the feeling of being invisible to the world. These memories were no longer open wounds, but a map that showed her a new mission. She knew that her story, now public, gave her a voice, and she decided to use it, not for herself, but for those who remained in the darkness. With the same silent determination with which she had saved Miguel, she spent months researching and planning. One night, she presented Gabriel with a detailed project, complete with budgets and timelines. It was not a request for charity. It was a business plan for hope. She wanted to create the Fresh Start Project, a foundation dedicated to supporting homeless mothers, offering not just a temporary roof, but the tools for rebuilding a life, psychological support, professional qualification, and legal aid. Gabriel, seeing the passion and intelligence in her plan, felt an overwhelming pride. He immediately gave up a vacant commercial property from his company and gave her carte blanche and all the necessary funding. Lorena dove into the project headfirst. She supervised the renovation, chose each piece of furniture thinking of the dignity of the future residents, and most importantly, personally interviewed each social worker and psychologist, ensuring that her team shared her vision of humane and non-judgmental care. Gabriel's participation in the Fresh Start project was the final proof of his transformation. He, who once measured success in figures and contracts, now found a new kind of value. He did not limit himself to signing checks. He used his vast network of contacts to mobilize an army of volunteers and donors. He got large companies to donate food, clothes, and toys. His team of lawyers began to offer free legal advice to the women served by the foundation, helping them to recover documents and fight for their rights. But his deepest change was seen in the small gestures. On weekends, it was common to find him at the foundation's headquarters, in jeans and a t-shirt, helping to unload a truck of donations or assembling a crib alongside other volunteers. He talked with the husbands and partners of the sheltered women, sharing his own story of failure and learning with a disarming humility. He discovered that the satisfaction of seeing a family get the key to a rented apartment, of seeing the smile of a mother who got her first formal job, was infinitely more rewarding and lasting than any millionaire bonus. The project became his life's passion, the pillar of his new legacy. He and Lorena were not just raising a son. Together, they were building a beacon of hope in the city. On a hot summer night, years after the dust had settled, the tranquility in the mansion was a soft melody. Miguel, now a 7-year-old boy, was sleeping the sleep of angels in his room. Lorena and Gabriel were sitting on the back porch, watching the stars, a routine they had adopted to relax after full days with work, the foundation, and their son's inexhaustible energy. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with an intimacy that dispensed with words. It was Gabriel who broke it, his voice low and reflective, not to her, but to the starry sky. I spent so many years thinking that life was about acquiring things, a bigger business, a more luxurious house, a more solid reputation. You taught me that life is about building. Building a person like we did with Miguel, building a bridge where there was a chasm like we did with the foundation. He turned to her, his eyes shining with an unarmed sincerity. For a long time, Lorena, I felt I had to pay a debt to you. But it's not that anymore. You have become my north, my best friend, my partner in everything. And somewhere along this path, without fanfare, without drama, my heart ceased to be just mine. It became yours. It was not a pickup line. It was not a proposal. It was a realization, the simple verbalization of a truth that already existed in the air they breathed. Lorena absorbed his words, feeling them land softly on her soul. There was no shock or surprise, only the recognition of a feeling that had also blossomed in her silently and gradually. She thought of the man he was, the arrogant boss who had humiliated her, the desperate father who had rescued her, and now the kind and admirable partner who sat beside her. She loved him. She loved the man he had strived to become. I think my heart also didn't notice when the change happened, she said, her voice equally serene. I arrived here broken, and the love for Miguel began to mend me. But it was your friendship, your respect, your transformation that made me feel whole again. The love I feel for you, Gabriel, is not a fairy tale love. It's a love that was born from forgiveness, a love that grew slowly, watered by trust and admiration. It's love for who you are today. He extended his hand, and she took it, their fingers intertwining with the naturalness of someone who had made that gesture 1,000 times. They didn't need a cinematic kiss to seal the moment. The grip of their hands, the complicit look, and the peace they felt were enough. Their love was not a lightning bolt that struck them, but a house they built together, brick by brick, on the rough terrain of their lives. And it was, for that very reason, indestructible. The scene transports to a later time. The mansion's garden, once a silent and impeccable space, now overflows with life. Colorful balloons dance in the wind, and the air is permeated with the smell of cake and the contagious sound of dozens of children screaming and laughing. It is Miguel's 10th birthday party. Near the cake table, a Donna Esther with completely white hair, but with a youthful sparkle in her eyes, helps her grandson unwrap a gift, laughing with him. In a corner, talking animatedly with a group of parents, is João, the man who once lived under the viaduct. He is now the head janitor of the Fresh Start project headquarters, a man whose dignity has been restored. Several of the guests are women who, like Lorena, have restarted their lives with the help of the foundation, their children now school friends of Miguel. It is a vibrant human tapestry, woven with threads of second chances. At the center of it all, Miguel, a 10-year-old boy with bright eyes and an easy smile, blows out the candles on his cake. Behind him, Lorena and Gabriel watch him. His arms are around her waist, her head rests lightly on his shoulder. They are no longer defined by the trauma that united them, but by the serene joy they have built. Their gazes are not of relief, but of a deep and lasting peace. And so, the narrator who witnessed every tear and every smile prepares to say goodbye. The story that began with the lonely cry of a baby in a silent room ends with a symphony of laughter in a sunny garden. The journey was long and the path tortuous. It showed that the grandest of mansions can be the coldest of prisons, and that the greatest treasure can be found in the arms of someone who has nothing to offer but their own heart. It proved that the truth, no matter how much it is buried under the weight of lies and prejudice, eventually finds its way to the light, and that forgiveness, though difficult, is the only key that can free the prisoner and the jailer. The family we see today was not born of blood, but of choice. The choice to forgive, the choice to trust, the choice to love again. And as the afternoon sun casts a golden light on the party, Miguel runs towards his parents. He doesn't choose one. He positions himself between the two, takes a hand from each and pulls them into an impromptu race on the grass. And there, in the image of the three of them holding hands, running and laughing together, we find the final point. Not a fairy tale ending, but something infinitely better. The beginning of a real, noisy, imperfect, and eternal happiness.